Centre for Progressive Change video podcast series. My name is Ron Burtonshaw. Today, Deirdre and I will be interviewing Mary Murphy. Mary Murphy is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology. She lectures in politics and society in NUI. For those who are following this interview, we will be basing it around a chapter in a book called Transforming Ireland. It's chapter 11, Mary's chapter on social policy in Ireland. And we will be structuring the interview roughly around past, present and future, beginning obviously with the past and asking Mary, in her opinion, what in the past caused the crisis or contributed to the crisis that we're now in.
Okay, well I think if we go back to the very start of the Irish state, I think some of the institutions of the Irish state and the way we structured the political institutions, in particular the Irish state, gave us a particular kind of political culture that was quite unambitious about social policy and about what we could aspire to for people in Ireland. Over time, I think the structures of the Irish state tended to be captured by vested interests. I suppose the Catholic Church would have been one of the first powerful vested interests. But over time, I think we created structures like corporatism, which enabled key institutions to direct the Irish state in the interest of a relatively narrow segment of the population. And I think because of that, policy increasingly began to be happening behind closed doors. What we see in Ireland a lot is an absence of public debate about values that would lead to public debate about policies. So we tend then not to understand a lot of our political decision making about allocation of resources, and we tend not to have a very vibrant civil society debating the issues of distribution and policy choices. And over time, I think, as Ireland became more globalised and was competing in the global market, social policy increasingly became more residual to economic competitiveness, to the end result where a lot of our policy decisions were taken very much with a view to enhancing competitiveness, and social policy was very much a secondary concern.
Okay, and these social policies that you're referring to they came from a very particular culture that we had in Ireland. Do you think that culture was contributed to by leaders or by society in general?
Well, I think it was a combination of the state and society, because I mentioned the church already, but it did have a very formative influence on the foundation stage of the Irish state, and it had a particular angle on social policy. For example, it was a very patriarchal state, and definitely the role of the church in being a leader in social policy reinforced that patriarchy and gave a certain gendered dimension to how policies were approached, which very much were about keeping women in a residual role in the economy and a primary role in the home. So definitely we see a flavour of social policy coming through, which was very much reflecting who the power interests were in the early foundation of the state.
Okay, and this, you refer to patriarchy, and that's something that you refer to in the chapter in your book as well, and you also make reference to the fact that Ireland has so few women leaders in politics, but also I think it would be probably fair to say in society as well. And you lead into just discussing how this affects the kind of society we have in terms of deficits of care and things like that. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the academic literature looks at this as well. When you don't have a substantive number of women participating, and it's not just in politics, as you say, it's in public debate as well, it's in the media, it's in the academic world. It's generally when you don't have a balanced communication of values, what you tend then to get is a set of social values that doesn't reflect the broad needs of society. And certainly we do have a deficit of care. And that's not just about childcare, it's about institutional care, it's about care of young people, it's about care of older people, but it's also about the general way we make room for people in our society. And I think very much increasingly over the last 20 years, the emphasis on economics really pushed out space for what people needed in society. There was an overemphasis on growth for the sake of growth, rather than growth for the sake of investing in society and in the kind of care infrastructure that really would increase people's quality of life and give us a more thriving kind of society. And that would affect men and women, because I think men's quality of life is inadequate because of the absence of a good care infrastructure, just as women's is. and children.
And one of the quotes that stood out to me from reading your chapter was you talked about the prioritising of efficiency over equity, and how this concept of efficiency was very, very big in pre-crisis Ireland. And how would you have seen that efficiency, and what were some of the things that it led to?
Well, for example, if you look just in broad terms, if you take childcare as an example, the whole emphasis in the childcare debate was on meeting the needs of the labour market in relation to childcare. So childcare became a serious issue when government accepted that it was an obstacle to women returning to work. Childcare wasn't taken as such a serious issue from a social policy perspective when the needs of children should have been taken into account, when we look at things like early childhood education being a serious contribution to more equality in society. So most things were taken with a litmus test of, well, how would this benefit competitiveness rather than how would this benefit society more broadly.
So it's a particular type of efficiency, I suppose that's what I'm getting at. It's just that when you...
No, there's nothing wrong at all with efficiency.
Yeah,
absolutely not. We should strive to be productive, we should strive to be efficient, we should strive to be an effective economy. I have no qualms with that at all. It's when we see competitiveness and efficiency as a very, very narrow concept which is solely related to maintaining profitability, maintaining investment levels, and maintaining our place in the competitiveness leagues of the world. That's a very narrow way of viewing efficiency. And I think I've used the phrase which belongs to a writer called Mark Bly, we were cognitively locked into a particularly narrow worldview of what an economic model needed to be. And it was a very narrow economic model which could only benefit very narrow objectives, in this case competitiveness objectives, not even wider economic objectives.
And the cognitive lock was another interesting term that was brought up. I wasn't familiar with it before I read the chapter, but it fed into your argument as well about how Ireland seeks to move forward in consensus and has a series of vetoes set up, and it seems like whereas other societies are more open to radical change, Ireland seems to constantly have either minor reforms or very, very little.
Yeah.
So our progress tends to be very, very slow. I'm wondering, do you feel that narrowness of ideas and cognitive lock and that system fed into the
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at our political culture, our education system, our system of social partnership, and even our electoral system and the clientelistic type of politics that it sort of breeds, I think what we get then is a political culture that does thrive on consensus and that fears conflict. So generally over the last 30 years or so, we've seen the state make very serious efforts to bring together social actors in committees and task forces, in social partnership, and really to try and manage debate in quite narrow spaces and in quite state-controlled spaces. So a lot of the debate that's gone on about what kind of society we have has been managed by the state according to the state's agenda and in processes that have been designed by the state. And I'm thinking of things like the NESF, the NESC, and thinking of task forces on education, and even a task force on volunteering or on active citizenship very much belonged and was controlled by the state. I think when that happens, we don't get the energy associated with broader societal debates that maybe have much more conflict of ideas in them. And the absence of conflict leads, I think, to the absence of energy and the absence of change.
And do you think that this is coming from a resistance to conflict? Do you think that there is something that in Irish society that is inherently resistant to conflict, or do you think that it's just over time we're resistant to change?
I don't think it's about changing slowly, because in a way we've seen fairly significant modernisation and very significant change in Ireland over the last 80 years. So I don't think it's about change. I do think it's about the nature of the political culture and the absence of conflict in it. And I think to some degree that can go back to this idea of a very populist political culture. And I think particularly the nature of the main party in Ireland, the main political party, who's been in power for by far the vast majority of the history of the Irish state has been Fianna Fáil. And I think their approach to power and their approach to political discourse is very much to promote this idea of the national interest, that we're all in it together, that we all have to share the pain. And their tentacles go out quite widely into civil society. So people who speak out or speak up against the national interest or perceived national interest tend to feel it quite sharply when they go against the grain. So I think there's quite a lot of subtle pressure on people to buy into consensus. And I think particularly then the way we've crafted our institutions of social partnership has reinforced that. So I think a lot of the potential debate has been channeled into quite narrow spaces. And there's quite a lot of social pressure, political pressure on actors in those spaces to continue with consensus. So for example, when some of the civil society organisations like Unity Platform were very much concerned about having to accept a broad parameters of what was conceived to be the economic model, they were told you either take that or you leave partnership. There was no room for debate about what the economic model should be. So the boundaries of public debate were set very narrowly. And I think it's that type of consensus that's dangerous, because it keeps us in a very narrow space and we don't question ourselves enough then about what's happening.
And you used the phrase, another interesting part of the chapter was, you used the phrase lowest common denominator for the outcome that you can get from that kind of consensus. And that just struck me as eminently sensible, this idea that if you don't have a broad spectrum of opinions competing with each other, that if everybody's trying to find just a few threads that they can agree with, you end up with lowest common denominator.
Yeah, and if you're absolutely trying to please everyone, then you have to spread your goods so thinly, then you do get lowest common denominator, and you get an absence of ambition. And I think that's one of the big problems that we have now is there's traditionally an absence of ambition, I think, in Irish politics, and that leads into a poverty of the imagination. Yeah. And I think what we have now, and what we're seeing the result of, is our imaginations are finding it very difficult to stretch collectively to alternatives that can get us out of this crisis in a way that's less damaging to social cohesion. So I think right now we're still at the cognitive block that we have to protect the economy at the expense of society. We haven't broken out of that focus on competitiveness, and we're willing to pay almost any price for society in order to protect the economy. And we're still in that grain of thought, we haven't broken through it.
I think that moves us nicely into our next segment on discussing the present and contemporary, where we've ended up in the NAMA era, and after the crisis and the banking guarantee and the years of rising unemployment. How do you consider Ireland in general to be dealing with the crisis?
Well, blindfolded to a large degree in terms of, I believe that there were quite consistent warning signals a decade ago that the economic model that we were pursuing was unsustainable. It was socially unsustainable, it was also economically unsustainable. There's lots of evidence, and particularly from the social policy end of the spectrum, where people were signaling in trouble long before the political system accepted that the economic model was in trouble. And I think there has been a very, very slow reaction to the need to think outside the box about accepting that economic model failed and trying to build a new one. There's still this desire to go back to the past, to get back to where we were, and maybe then not make the same mistakes again. But going back to recreate the conditions of the Celtic Tiger is making the same mistake again, I think. Our problem at the moment, though, is that there is a very only slowly emerging voice about the need to articulate alternatives, and it's not very clear yet, I think, even from those actors in civil society who are trying to articulate alternatives. It's actually proven really challenging to articulate or imagine even a different kind of economic and social model that could take us out of the crisis and build us a better society in the future. I think we're all collectively challenged to do that, because some of the fault lines in Irish politics and society leave us less than adequate in terms of meeting the challenge of trying to design a new one. So we can only break the cognitive block of the old model if we have ideas about a new model. Because if you like, we need ideas that can serve as weapons in public debate, but we also need ideas that can serve as a blueprint to convince people that there is actually a genuinely practical, feasible alternative to the old model. And I think we're only constructing that blueprint as we go along, and we haven't quite got there yet, so people aren't confident in a new model. And I think that's a big challenge for politics and for society.